The Road to Makkah. By Muhammad Asad. 8 JINNS, Section 1-3. 1. The sun is about to set when a big, black snake suddenly slithers across our path. It is almost as thick as a child's arm and perhaps a yard long. It stops and rears its head in our direction. With almost a reflex movement, I slide down from the saddle, unsling my carbine, kneel and take aim, and at the same moment I hear Mansur's voice behind me. "Don't shoot, don't." But I have already pressed the trigger. The snake jerks, writhes, and is dead. Mansur's disapproving face appears over me. "Thou shouldst not have killed it?" "Anyhow, not at the time of sunset, for this is the time when the jinns come out from underground and often assume the shape of a snake." I laugh and reply, "O Mansur, thou dost not really believe those old wives' tales about jinns in the shape of snakes?" "Of course, I believe in jinns. Does not the Book of God mention them? As to the shapes in which they sometimes appear to us, I don't know. I have heard they can assume the strangest and most unexpected of forms." "You may be right, Mansur," I think to myself, for, indeed, is it so far-fetched to assume that, apart from the beings which our senses can perceive, there may be some that elude our perception? Is it not a kind of intellectual arrogance which makes modern men reject the possibility of life forms other than that which can be observed and measured by him? The existence of jinns, whatever they may be, cannot be proved by scientific means. But neither can science disprove the possible existence of living beings whose biological laws may be so entirely different from our own that our outer senses can establish contact with them only under very exceptional circumstances. Is it not possible that such an occasional crossing of paths between these unknown worlds and ours gives rise to strange manifestations which man's primitive fantasy has interpreted as ghosts, demons, and such other supernatural apparitions? As I'll remount my dromedary, playing with these questions with the half-smiling disbelief of a man, whose upbringing has made him more thick-skinned than are people who have always lived closer to nature, Zaid turns with a serious countenance toward me. "Mansur is right, O my uncle. Thou shouldst not have killed the snake. Once, many years back, when I left Hale after Ibn Saud had taken the town, I shot a snake like that one on my way to Iraq. It was also at the time when the sun was setting. A short while afterward, when we stopped to say our sunset prayer, I suddenly felt a leaden weight in my legs and a burning in my head, and my head began to roar like the roar of falling waters, and my limbs became like fire, and I could not stand upright and fell to the ground like an empty sack, and everything became dark around me. I do not know how long I remained in that darkness, but I remember that in the end I stood up again. An unknown man stood to my right and another to my left, and they led me into a great, dusky hall that was full of men who walked up and down in excitement and talked to each other. After a while I became aware that these were two distinct parties, as before a court of justice. An old man of very small size was sitting on a raised dais in the background. He seemed to be a judge or chieftain, or something like that. And all at once I knew that I was the accused. Someone said, "He has killed him just before sunset by a shot from his rifle." "He is guilty," one of the opposing parties retorted, "but he did not know whom he was killing, and he pronounced the name of God when he pulled the trigger." But those of the accusing party shouted, "He did not pronounce it." Whereupon the other party repeated, all together, in chorus, he did praise the name of God." And so it continued for a while, back and forth, accusation and defense, until in the end the defending party seemed to gain their point and the judge in the background decided, he did not know whom he was killing, and he did praise the name of God. "Lead him back." And the two men who had brought me to the hall of judgment took me under the arms again, led me back the same way into that great darkness out of which I had come, and laid me on the ground. I opened my eyes, and saw myself lying between a few sacks of grain which had been piled on both sides of me, and over them was stretched a piece of tent cloth to protect me from the rays of the sun. It seemed to be early forenoon, and my companions had evidently made camp. In the distance I could see our camels grazing on the slope of a hill. I wanted to raise my hand, but my limbs were extremely weary. When one of my companions bent his face over me, I said, "Coffee." For from nearby I heard the sound of the coffee mortar. My friend jumped up. "He speaks, he speaks. He has come to." And they brought me fresh, hot coffee. I asked them, was I unconscious the whole night? And they answered, "The whole night? Full 4 days thou didst not budge. We always loaded thee like a sack onto one of the camels and unloaded thee again at night, and we thought that we would have to bury thee here. But praise be to him who gives and takes life, the living who never dies. So thou seest, O my uncle, one should not kill a snake at sunset." And although half of my mind continues to smile at Zaid's narrative, the other half seems to sense the weaving of unseen forces in the gathering dusk, an eerie commotion of sounds so fine that the ear can hardly grasp them, and a breath of hostility in the air, and I have a faint feeling of regret at having shot the snake at sunset. 2. In the afternoon of our third day out of Hall we stopped to water our camels at the wells of Arja, in an almost circular valley enclosed between low hills. The 2 wells, large and full of sweet water, lie in the center of the alley. Each of them is the communal property of the tribe. The western one belongs to the Harb, the eastern to the Mutair. The ground around them is as bald as the palm of one's hand, for every day around noon hundreds of camels and sheep are driven in from distant pastures to be watered here, and every little blade of grass which grows out of the soil is nibbled away before it can even take breath. As we arrive, the valley is full of animals, and ever new flocks and herds appear from between the sun-drenched hills. Around the wells there is a great crowding and commotion, for it is not an easy thing to satisfy the thirst of so many animals. The herdsmen draw up the water in leather buckets on long ropes, accompanying their work with a chant to keep the multiple movements even, for the buckets are very big and, when filled with water, so heavy that many hands are needed to draw them out of the depth. From the well nearest us, the one that belongs to the Mutair tribe, I can hear the men chant to the camels, "Drink, and spare no water." The well is full of grace and has no bottom. Half of the men sing the first verse and the others the second, repeating both several times in quick tempo until the bucket appears over the rim of the well. Then the women take over and pour the water into leithern troughs. Scores of camels press forward, bellowing and snorting, quivering with excitement, crowding around the trough, not visibly pacified by the men's soothing calls, "Huoi! Lai yoi!" One and another pushes its long, flexible neck forward, between or over its companions, so as to still its thirst as quickly as possible. There is a rocking and pushing, a swaying and thronging of light brown and dark brown, yellow-white and black-brown and honey-colored bodies, and the sharp, acrid smell of animal sweat and urine fills the air. In the meantime, the bucket has been filled again, and the herdsmen draw it up to the quick accompaniment of another couplet. Naught can still the camel's thirst but God's grace and the herdsman's toil. And the spectacle of rushing water, of drinking, and slurping and calling and chanting starts all over again. An old man standing on the rim of the well raises his arm in our direction and calls out, "May God give you life, O wayfarers! Partake of our bounty." Whereupon several other men disentangle themselves from the crowd around the well and run toward us. One of them takes hold of my dromedary's halter and makes it kneel down, so that I may dismount in comfort. Quickly a way is made for our animals to the trough, and the women pour out water for them, for we are travelers and therefore have a prior claim. Is it not wonderful to behold, muses Zaid, how well these Harb and Mutair are keeping their peace now, so soon after they have been warring against each other? For it is only 3 years since the Mutair were in rebellion against the king, while the Harb were among his most faithful supporters. Dost thou remember, O my uncle, the last time we were here? How we bypassed Arja in a wide circle at night, not daring to approach the wells, not knowing whether friend or foe was here. Zaid is referring to the Great Bedouin Rebellion of 1928 to 1929, the culmination of a political drama which shook Ibn Saud's kingdom to its foundations and, for a time, involved myself in it. When the curtain rose in 1927, peace was reigning in the vast realm of Saudi Arabia. King Ibn Saud's struggle for power was over. His rule in Najd was no longer contested by any rival dynasty. His was Hale and the Shamir country, and his, too, was the Hijaz after he had ousted the Sharifian dynasty in 1925. Outstanding among the king's warriors was that same redoubtable Bedouin chieftain, Faisal ad-Dawish, who had caused him so much worry in earlier years. Ad-Dawish had distinguished himself in the king's service and proved his loyalty time and time again. In 1921 he conquered Hale for the king. In 1924 he led a daring raid into Iraq, from where the Sharifian family, protected by the British, intrigued against Ibn Saud. In 1925 he took Medina and played a decisive role in the conquest of Jeddah. And now, in the summer of 1927, he was resting on his laurels in his Ikhwan settlement of Arta'iyya, not far from the frontier of Iraq. For many years that frontier had been the scene of almost continuous Bedouin raids arising from tribal migrations in search of pastures and water. But in a series of agreements between Ibn Saud and the British, who were responsible for Iraq as the mandatory power, it had been decided that no obstacles should be placed in the way of such necessary migrations, and that no fortifications of any kind should be erected on either side of the Najd-Iraq frontier. In the summer of 1927, however, the Iraqi government built and garrisoned a fort in the vicinity of the frontier wells of Bisaya, and officially announced its intention to build other forts along the frontier. A ripple of uneasiness ran through the tribes of northern Najd. They saw themselves threatened in their very existence, cut off from the wells on which they were entirely dependent. Ibn Saud protested against this open breach of agreements, only to receive, months later, an evasive answer from the British High Commissioner in Iraq. Faisal ad-Dawish, always a man of action, told himself, "It may not be convenient for the king to start a quarrel with the British, but I will dare it." And in the last days of October 1927, he set out at the head of his Ikhwan, attacked and destroyed the fort of Bisaya, giving no quarter to its Iraqi garrison. British aeroplanes appeared over the scene, reconnoitered the situation and withdrew, against their habit, without dropping a single bomb. It would have been easy for them to repel the raid, an action to which they were entitled by virtue of their treaties with Ibn Saud, and then to settle the problem of the forts by diplomatic negotiations. But was the British Iraqi government really interested in a speedy, peaceful settlement of the dispute? Deputations from the northern Najdi tribes appeared before Ibn Saud and pleaded for a campaign against Iraq. Ibn Saud energetically refused all such demands, declared ad-Dawish a transgressor, and ordered the Amir of Hale to keep close watch over the frontier regions. The financial allowances which the king was giving to most of the Ikhwan were temporarily cut off from the tribes under ad-Dawish's control, and he himself was bidden to remain at Arta'iyya and there await the king's judgment. The Iraqi government was officially informed of all these measures and notified that ad-Dawish would be punished severely. At the same time, however, Ibn Saud demanded that in the future the frontier treaties be more strictly observed by Iraq. This new conflict could thus have been easily ironed out. But when matters had reached this point, the British High Commissioner let Ibn Saud know that he was sending out an air squadron to chastise ad-Daesh's Ikhwan, who had long since returned to their home territory, and to force them to obedience toward their king. Since at the time there was no telegraph at Riyadh, Ibn Saud sent post-haste a courier to Bahrain, from where a telegram was dispatched to Baghdad, protesting again the proposed measure and invoking the treaties which forbade either party to pursue lawbreakers across the frontier. He stressed that he had no need of British assistance in enforcing his authority over ad-Daesh, and, finally, he warned that a British air action over Najdi territory would have dangerous repercussions among the Ikhwan, who were already sufficiently stirred up. The warning remained unheeded. Toward the end of January 1928, 3 months after the Bisaya incident, a British squadron flew across the frontier and bombed Najdi territory, wreaking havoc among Mutayri Bedouin encampments and indiscriminately killing men, women, children, and cattle. All the northern Ikhwan began to prepare for a campaign of vengeance against Iraq, and it was only thanks to Ibn Saud's great prestige among the tribes that the movement was stopped in time and confined to a few minor frontier skirmishes. In the meantime, the destroyed fort of Bisaya was quietly rebuilt by the British and 2 new forts were erected on the Iraqi side of the border. Faisal ad-Daesh, summoned to Riyadh, refused to come and justify an action which, in his opinion, had been undertaken in the king's own interest. Personal resentment added to his bitterness. He, Faisal ad-Daesh, who had served the king so faithfully and so well, was only Amir of Arta'iyya, which, in spite of the large number of its inhabitants, was no more than an overgrown village. His leadership had been decisive in the conquest of Han, but the king's cousin, Ibn Mas'ud, and not he, had been appointed Amir of Hale. During the Hijaz campaign it was he, ad-Daesh, who besieged Medina for months and finally forced its surrender, but not he had been made its Amir. His passionate, frustrated urge for power gave him no rest. He said to himself, Ibn Saud belongs to the tribe of Anaza and I to the tribe of Mutayr. We are equal to another in the nobility of our descent. Why should I admit to Ibn Saud's superiority? Such reasoning has always been the curse of Arabian history, none will admit that another is better than he. One by one, other dissatisfied Ikhwan chieftains began to forget how much they owed to Ibn Saud. Among them was Sultan Ibn Bujid, Sheikh of the powerful Atayba tribe and Amir of Gotgad, one of the largest Ikhwan settlements in Najd, victor of the Battle of Taraba in 1918 against the forces of Sharif Hussain, conqueror of Taif and Mecca in 1924. Why had he to be content with being no more than Amir of Gotgad? Why had not he, but one of the king's sons, been made Amir of Mecca? Why had he not at least been appointed Amir of Taif? He, like Faisal ad-Daesh, saw himself cheated of what he considered his due, and since he was ad-Daesh's brother-in-law, it appeared only logical for the two to make common cause against Ibn Saud. In the autumn of 1928, Ibn Saud called a congress of chieftains and ulama to Riyadh with a view to solving all these disputes. Almost all tribal leaders came except Ibn Bujid and ad-Daesh. Adamant in their opposition, they declared Ibn Saud a heretic, for had he not made treaties with the infidels and introduced into the lands of the Arabs such instruments of the devil as motor cars, telephones, wireless sets and aeroplanes? The ulama assembled at Riyadh unanimously declared that such technical innovations were not only permissible but most desirable from the religious point of view, since they increased the knowledge and strength of the Muslims, and that, on the authority of the Prophet of Islam, treaties with non-Muslim powers were equally desirable if they brought peace and freedom to Muslims. but the two rebellious chieftains continued their denunciations and found a ready echo among many of the simple Ikhwan, who did not possess sufficient knowledge to see anything but the influence of Satan in Ibn Saud's actions. His earlier failure to impart education to the Ikhwan and turn their religious fervor to positive ends began to bear its tragic fruit. The steppes of Najd were now humming like a beehive. Mysterious emissaries rode on fast dromedaries from tribe to tribe. Clandestine meetings of chieftains took place at remote wells. And, finally, the agitation against the king burst out in open revolt, drawing in many other tribes besides the Mutayr and Ataba. The king was patient. He tried to be understanding. He sent messengers to the recalcitrant tribal leaders and tried to reason with them, but in vain. Central and northern Arabia became the scene of widespread guerrilla warfare. The almost proverbial public security of the country vanished and complete chaos reigned in Najd. Bands of rebel Ikhwan swept across it in all directions, attacking villages and caravans and tribes that had remained loyal to the king. After innumerable local skirmishes between rebel and loyal tribes, a decisive battle was fought on the plain of Sibila, in central Najd, in the spring of 1929. On one side was the king with a large force, on the other, the Mutayr and the Ataba, supported by factions from other tribes. The king was victorious. Ibn Buleddinjad surrendered unconditionally and was brought in chains to Riyadh. Ad-Da'ish was severely wounded and said to be dying. Ibn Saud, mildest of all Arabian kings, sent his personal physician to attend him, and that doctor, a young Syrian, diagnosed a serious injury to the liver, giving Ad-Da'ish a week to live, whereupon the king decided, "We shall let him die in peace, he has received his punishment from God." He ordered that the wounded enemy be brought back to his family at Arta'iyah. But Ad-Da'ish was far from dying. His injury was not nearly as serious as the young doctor had assumed, and within a few weeks he was sufficiently recovered to slip away from Arta'iyah, more than ever bent on revenge. Ad-Da'ish's escape from Arta'iyah gave a new impetus to the rebellion. It was rumored that he himself was somewhere in the vicinity of the Kuwait frontier recruiting new tribal allies to his own, still considerable, force of Mutayr. Among the first to join him were the Ayman, a small but valiant tribe living in the province of Al-Hassa near the Persian Gulf. Their sheikh, Ibn Hadlain, was Faisal ad-Da'ish's maternal uncle. Apart from this, there was no love lost between Ibn Saud and the Ayman. Years ago, they had slain the king's younger brother Saad and, fearing his revenge, had migrated to Kuwait. Subsequently Ibn Saud had forgiven them and allowed them to return to their ancestral territory, but the old resentment continued to rankle. It flared up into open enmity when, during negotiations for a settlement, the Ayman chieftain and several of his followers were treacherously murdered in the camp of Ibn Saud's relative, the eldest son of the Amir of Al-Hassa. The alliance of the Ayman with the Mutayr kindled a new spark among the Ataba tribes in central Najd. After the capture of their Amir, Ibn Bujad, they had reassembled under a new chieftain, and now they rose once again against the king, forcing him to divert most of his strength from northern to central Najd. The fight was hard, but slowly Ibn Saud got the upper hand. Group after group, he overwhelmed the Ataba until, in the end, they offered to surrender. In a village halfway between Riyadh and Mecca their sheikhs pledged fealty to the king, and the king again forgave them. Hoping that at least he would have a free hand against Ad-Da'ish and the rest of the rebels in the north. But hardly had he returned to Riyadh when the Atabiya broke their pledge for the second time and renewed their warfare. Now it was a fight to the finish. For a third time the Ataba were defeated and almost decimated, and with the complete destruction of the Ikhwan settlement of Gotgad. A town larger than Riyadh, the king's authority was re-established in central Najd. Meanwhile, the struggle in the north continued. Faisal ad-Dawish and his allies were now solidly entrenched in the vicinity of the border. Ibn Musaid, the Amir of Hale, attacked them time and time again in behalf of the king. Twice it was reported that ad-Dawish had been killed, and both times the tidings proved false. He lived on, stubbornly and uncompromisingly. His eldest son and 700 of his warriors fell in battle, but he fought on. The question cropped up, from where does ad-Dawish receive the money which even in Arabia is necessary for waging war? From where his arms and ammunition? Vague reports became current that the rebel, once so bitterly critical of Ibn Saud's treaty relations with the infidels, was now himself treating with the British. Rumor had it that he was a frequent visitor in Kuwait. Could he be doing this, people asked themselves, without the knowledge of the British authorities? Was it not possible, rather, that turmoil in the lands of Ibn Saud suited their own purpose only too well? One evening in Riyadh, in the summer of 1929, I had gone to bed early and, before falling asleep, was diverting myself with an old book on the dynasties of Oman, when Zayd abruptly came into my room. "There is a man here from the Shuyukh. He wants to see thee at once." I hurriedly dressed and went to the castle. Ibn Saud was awaiting me in his private apartments, sitting cross-legged on a divan with heaps of Arabic newspapers around him and one from Cairo in his hands. He answered my greeting briefly and, without interrupting his reading, motioned me to his side on the divan. After a while he looked up, glanced at the slave was standing by the door and indicated with a movement of his hand that he wished to be left alone with me. As soon as the slave had closed the door behind him, the king laid down the newspaper and looked at me for a while from behind his glittering glasses. As if he had not seen me for a long time, although I had spent some hours with him that very morning. "Busy with writing?" "No, O long of age, I have not written anything for weeks." "Those were interesting articles thou hast written about our frontier problems with Iraq." He was evidently referring to a series of dispatches I had written for my continental newspapers about 2 months earlier. Some of them had also appeared in a newspaper in Cairo where, I flatter myself, they helped to clarify a very involved situation. Knowing the king, I was certain that he was not speaking at random but had something definite in mind, and so I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. He did continue. "Perhaps thou wouldst like to write something more about what is happening in Najd, about this rebellion and what it portends." There was a trace of passion in his voice as he went on. "The Sharifian family hates me. Those sons of Hussain who now rule in Iraq and Transjordan will always hate me, for they cannot forget that I have taken the Hijaz from them. They would like my realm to break up, for then they could return to the Hijaz. And their friends, who pretend to be my friends as well, might not dislike it either. They did not build those forts for nothing, they wanted to cause me trouble and to push me away from their frontiers." From behind Ibn Saud's words I could hear jumbled, ghostly sounds, the rolling and rushing of railroad trains which, though still imaginary, might easily become real tomorrow, the specter of a British railroad running from Haifa to Basra. Rumors of such a plan had been rampant for years. It was well known that the British were concerned about securing the land route to India, and this, indeed, was the meaning of their mandates over Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. A railroad from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf would not only form a new, valuable link in Britain's imperial communications but would also afford greater protection to the oil pipeline that was to be laid from Iraq across the Syrian desert to Haifa. On the other hand, a direct rail connection between Haifa and Basra would have to cut across Ibn Saud's northeastern provinces, and the king would never even entertain such a suggestion. Was it not possible that the building of forts along the Iraq-Najd frontier, in flagrant contravention of all the existing agreements, represented the first stage of a carefully devised scheme to bring about enough disturbance within this critical area to justify the establishment of a small, semi-independent buffer state more amenable to the British? Faisal ad-Daesh could serve this purpose as well as, or perhaps even better than, a member of the Sharifian family, for he was a Najdi himself and had a strong following among the Lakhwan. That his alleged religious fanaticism was only a mask was obvious to anyone acquainted with his past. What he really wanted was power alone. There was no doubt that, left to himself, he could not have held out for so long against Ibn Saud. But, had he been left to himself? After a long pause, the king continued, I have been thinking, as everyone has, about the supplies of arms and ammunition that ad-Daesh seems to have at his disposal. He has plenty of them, and plenty of money, too, it has been reported to me. I wonder whether thou wouldst not like to write about these things, I mean, those mysterious sources of ad-Daesh's supplies. I have my own suspicions about them, perhaps even more than suspicions, but I would like thee to find out for thyself all thou canst, for I may be wrong. So that was it? Although the king spoke almost casually, in a conversational tone, it was obvious that he had weighed every word before he uttered it. I looked hard at him. His face, so grave a moment before, broke into a broad smile. He placed his hand on my knee and shook it. I want thee, O my son, to find out for thyself, I repeat, for thyself, from where ad-Daesh is getting his rifles, his ammunition, and the money he is throwing about so lavishly. There is, hardly any doubt in my own mind, but I wish that someone like thee, who is not directly involved, would tell the world of the crooked truth behind ad-Daesh's rebellion. I think thou wilt be able to find out the truth. Ibn Saud knew what he was doing. He has always known that I love him. Although I often disagree with his policies, and never make a secret of my disagreement, he has never withheld his confidence from me and often asks my advice. He trusts me all the more, I believe, because he is well aware that I do not expect any personal gain from him and would not even accept a post in his government, for I want to remain free. And so, on that memorable evening in the summer of 1929, he calmly suggested to me that I should go out and explore the web of political intrigue behind the Lakhwan rebellion, a mission which probably entailed personal risk and certainly could be accomplished only at the cost of strenuous effort. But the Shuyukh was not disappointed in my reactions. Apart from my affection for him and his country, the task which he now entrusted to me seemed to promise an exciting adventure, not to speak of a possible journalistic scoop. Over my eyes and my head be thy command, O long of age, I immediately replied. I shall certainly do what I can. Of that I have no doubt, O Muhammad, and I expect thee to keep thy mission a secret. There may be danger in it. What about thy wife? The wife was a girl from Riyadh whom I had married the previous year, but I was able to assure the king on this point. She will not cry, O Imam, it was only today that I was thinking of divorcing her. We do not seem to suit one another. Ibn Saud smiled knowingly, for divorcing a wife was a thing not unfamiliar to him. But what about other people, thy kinsfolk? There is no one, I believe, who would mourn should anything happen to me, except, of course, Zayd, but he will accompany me in any case, and the things that befall me will befall him as well. That is all to the good, replied the king. And, oh, before I forget, thou wilt require some funds for the undertaking, and slipping his hand under the cushion behind him, he drew out a purse and thrust it into my hand. From its weight I immediately guessed that it was, filled with golden sovereigns. I remember thinking of myself, how certain he must have been, even before he asked me, that I would accept his suggestion. Back in my quarters, I called Zaid, who had been awaiting my return. If I should thee, Zaid, to accompany me on an enterprise that might prove dangerous, wouldst thou go with me? Zaid replied, Dost thou think, O my uncle, that I would let thee go alone, whatever the danger? But where are we going? We are going to find out from where Ad-Daesh is getting his arms and his money. But the king insists that no one should know what we are doing until it has been done, so, thou must be on guard. Zaid did not even bother to reassure me, but turned instead to the more practical question. We can't very well ask Ad-Daesh or his men, how then do we set about it? On my way back from the castle I had been ruminating over this problem. It appeared to me that the best starting point would be one of the cities of central Najd, where there were many merchants who had intimate connections with Iraq and Kuwait. Finally I settled upon Shakra, the capital of the province of Washm, about 3 days' journey from Riyadh, where my friend Abdurrahman as-Sibai might be able to help me. The following day was occupied with preparations for our expedition. As I did not want to attract too much attention to my movements, I cautioned Zaid not to draw provisions, as was customary with us, from the king's storehouses, but to purchase everything we needed from the bazaar. By evening Zaid had collected the necessary assortment of foodstuffs, about 20 pounds of rice, the same amount of flour for bread, a small skin containing clarified butter, dates, coffee beans, and salt. He had also bought 2 new water skins, a leather bucket and a goat hair rope long enough for very deep wells. We were already well provided with arms and ammunition. Into our saddlebags we fed 2 changes of clothing per man, and each of us wore a heavy abaya which, together with the blankets over our saddles, would serve as covering on cool nights. Our dromedaries, which had spent several weeks at pasture, were in excellent condition. The one I had recently given to Zaid was an extremely fleet Omani racer, while I rode the beautiful old northern thoroughbred which had once belonged to the last Rashidi Amir of Hale and had been presented to me by Ibn Saud. After nightfall we rode out of Riyadh. By dawn we reached Wadi Hanifa, a deep, barren riverbed between steep hills, the site of the decisive battle fought over 1300 years ago between the Muslim forces of Abu Bakr, the Prophet's successor and first Caliph of Islam, and those of the false prophet, Musaylama, who for many years had opposed the Muslims. The battle signaled the final victory of Islam in Central Arabia. Many of the original companions of the Prophet fell in it, and their graves are visible to this day on the rocky slopes of the wadi. During the forenoon we passed the ruined city of Ayna, once a large, populous settlement, stretching along both banks of Wadi Hanifa. Between rows of tamarisks lay the remnants of the past. Broken down house walls, with the crumbling pillars of a mosque or the ruin of a palatial building rising here and there, all of them speaking of a higher, more gracious style of architecture than that of the simple mud buildings one sees in present-day Najd. It is said that until about 150 or 200 years ago, the entire course of Wadi Hanifa from Diariya, the original capital of the Ibn Saud dynasty, to Ayna, a distance of over 15 miles, was one single city, and that when a son was born to the Amir of Diariya, the news of his birth, passed along from rooftop to rooftop by the women, traveled within minutes to the utmost end of Ayna. The story of Ayna's decay is so clouded by legends that it is difficult to discern the historical facts. Most probably the town was destroyed by the first Saudi ruler when it refused to accept the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, but Wahhabi legend has it that, as a sign of God's wrath, all the wells of Ayna dried up in a single night, forcing the inhabitants to abandon the city. At noon of the 3rd day, We sighted the mud walls and bastions of Shakra and the high palms which towered above its houses. We rode between empty orchards and through empty streets, and only then we remembered that it was Friday and that everyone must be at the mosque. Off and on we encountered a woman cloaked from head to toe in a black abaya. She would start at the sight of the strangers and draw her veil across her face with a quick, shy movement. Here and there children played in the shadow of the houses, a solid warmth was brooding over the crowns of the palms. We went straight to the house of my good friend Abdurrahman as-Sibai, who at that time was in charge of the Bait al-Mal, or treasury, of the province. We dismounted before the open gate and Zayd called into the courtyard, "Ya Walid." "Oh boy." And as a servant boy came running out of the house, Zayd announced, "Guests are here." While Zayd and the boy busied themselves with unsaddling the dromedaries in the courtyard, I made myself at home in Abdurrahman's kawa, where another servant immediately lit a fire under the brass pots on the coffee hearth. Hardly had I drunk the first sip when voices became audible from the courtyard, questions and answers rang out, the master of the house had returned. Already from the staircase, still invisible, he shouted his greeting of welcome to me, and then appeared in the doorway with open arms, a delicate little man with a short, light brown beard and a pair of deep-set, humorous eyes in a smiling face. In spite of the heat, he wore a long fur coat under his abaya. This fur coat was one of his most treasured possessions. He never tired of telling everyone who was not already aware of its history that it had once belonged to the former king of the Hijaz, Sharif Hussain, and had fallen into his, Abdurrahman's, hands at the conquest of Mecca in 1924. I cannot remember ever having seen him without that coat. He embraced me warmly and, standing on his toes, kissed me on both cheeks, "Ahlan wa zalan wa marhaba." "Welcome to this lowly house, O my brother. Lucky is the hour that brings thee here." And then came the usual questions, whence, and where to, and how is the king, and was there rain on the way, or didst thou at least hear of rains? The whole traditional exchange of Arabian news. I told him that Anazah, in central Najd, was my destination, which was not quite true but could well have been. In earlier years Abdurrahman had been engaged in extensive trade between Najd and Iraq and was thoroughly familiar with both Basra and Kuwait. It was not difficult to get him to talk of those places and to sound him out about people who might recently have arrived from there, for it seemed to me that with Faisal ad-Daesh being reported so near the border of Kuwait, either that place or Basra might furnish some indication as to his source of supplies. I learned that a member of the well-known Al-Bassam family of Anazah, an old acquaintance of mine, had recently visited Kuwait on the way back from Basra, and, not wanting to expose himself to the hazards of a journey through rebel-infested territory, had returned via Bahrain to Najd. He was in Shakra at present, and if I wanted, Abdurrahman would send for him, for, in accordance with ancient Arabian custom, it is for the new arrival to be visited rather than to pay visits. Soon afterward, Abdullah al-Bassam joined us in Abdurrahman's kawa. Abdullah, although belonging to perhaps the most important family of businessmen in all Najd, was not himself a rich man. His life had been full of ups and downs, mostly downs, experienced not only in Najd but also in Cairo, Baghdad, Basra, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Bombay. He knew everybody who was anybody in those places, and carried in his shrewd head a store of information about everything that was going on in Arab countries. I told him that I had been asked by a German business firm to explore the possibilities of importing agricultural machinery into Kuwait and Basra. And since I had been offered a fat commission by the firm, I was anxious to find out which of the local merchants in those two towns were likely to entertain such a proposition. Bassam mentioned several names, and then added, I am sure that some of the Kuwaiti people will be interested in thy project. They are always importing things from abroad, and nowadays trade seems to be quite lively, so lively that large consignments of silver reals are arriving almost every day directly from the mint at Trieste. The mention of the silver reals gave me a jolt. This particular kind of real, the Maria Theresa thaler, constituted, side by side with the official Arabian currencies, the chief commercial coinage of the entire peninsula. It was minted at Trieste and sold at its silver value. Plus a small minting charge to the various governments and also to a few outstanding merchants with large trade interests among the Bedouins, for the Bedouins were averse to accepting paper money and took only gold or silver, preferably Maria Theresa thalers. Large imports of these coins by Kuwaiti traders seemed to indicate that a brisk business was going on between them and the Bedouins. Why? I asked Al-Biasem. Should Kuwaiti merchants import reals just now? I do not know, he replied, with a trace of perplexity in his voice. They talk of buying meat camels from Bedouins near Kuwait for sale in Iraq, where the prices are high nowadays, though I do not quite see how they expect to find many camels in the steppes around Kuwait in these disturbed times. I should rather think, he added with a laugh, that it would be more profitable to buy riding camels in Iraq and to sell them to Ad-Daesh and his men, but, of course, Ad-Daesh would not have the money to pay for them. Would he not? Indeed. That night, before going to bed in the room assigned to us by our host, I drew Zaid into a corner and told him, "We are going to Kuwait. It will not be easy." "Oh, my uncle," replied Zaid, but the gleam in his eyes spoke more eloquently than his words of his readiness to embark on something that was not only not easy but extremely dangerous. It would, of course, be child's play to travel across territory controlled by forces and tribes loyal to the king. But for at least 100 miles or so before reaching the borders of Kuwait we would be entirely on our own in the midst of hostile territory through which the rebellious Mutayr and Ayman tribesmen were roaming. We could, of course, travel to Kuwait by sea via Bahrain, but that would require a permit from the British authorities and thus expose all our movements to the closest scrutiny. The same objection would apply to traveling via Al-Jaf and the Syrian desert into Iraq, and thence to Kuwait, for it would be too optimistic to suppose that we could slip through the many control points in Iraq. There remained, therefore, nothing but the direct overland route to Kuwait. How to penetrate undetected into the town itself was a question that could not be easily answered at present, and so, we left it to the future, trusting in our luck and hoping for unforeseen opportunities. Abdurrahman as-Sibai wanted me to stay with him for some days, but when I pleaded urgent business, he let us go the next morning, after augmenting our food supply by a quantity of dried camel meat, a delicious addition to the rather monotonous fare ahead of us. He also insisted that I should visit him on my return journey, to which, in truth, I could only answer, "Insha Allah, God willing." From Shakra we traveled for 4 days toward northeast without encountering anything unusual. On one occasion we were stopped by a detachment of loyal Awazim Bedouins who formed part of Amir ibn Musad's forces, but my open letter from the king immediately put them at rest and, after the customary exchange of desert tidings, we continued on our way. Before dawn of the 5th day we approached a region over which Ibn Saud's arm no longer extended. From now on day travel was out of the question, our only safety lay in darkness and stealth. We made camp in a convenient gully not far from the main course of the great Wadi ar-Rumah, the ancient, dry river bed that runs across northern Arabia toward the head of the Persian Gulf. The gully was thickly overhung with arfage bushes, which would afford us some cover as long as we kept close to the almost vertical bank. We hobbled our camels securely, fed them a mixture of coarse barley flour and date kernels, thus obviating the necessity of letting them out to pasture, and settled down to await the nightfall. We did not dare light a fire, for even in daytime its smoke might betray us, and so we had to content ourselves with a meal of dates and water. How sound our precautions were became evident in the late afternoon, when the strains of a Bedouin riding chant suddenly struck our ears. We took hold of our camels' muzzles to prevent them from snorting or bellowing, and pressed ourselves, rifle in hand, flat against the protecting wall of the gully. The chanting grew louder as the unknown riders approached. We could already discern the words, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, there is no God but God. The usual Laquan substitute for the more worldly travel chants of unreformed Bedouins. There was no doubt that these were Laquan, and in this area they could only be hostile Laquan. After a while they appeared over the crest of a hillock. Just above the bank of the gully, a group of 8 or 10 camel riders slowly advancing in single file. Sharply outlined against the afternoon sky. Each of them wearing the white Laquan turban over his red and white checked kufiya. 2 bandoliers across the chest and a rifle slung on the saddle peg behind him, a somber and forbidding cavalcade, swaying forward and backward, in rhythm with the gait of the dromedaries and the great but now so misused words, La ilaha illallah. The sight was impressive and at the same time pathetic. These were men to whom their faith obviously meant more than anything else in life. They thought they were fighting for its purity and for the greater glory of God, not knowing that their fervor and their longing had been harnessed to the ambitions of an unscrupulous leader in quest of personal power. They were on the right side of the gully as far as we were concerned, for had they been riding on the opposite side, they would have seen us as plainly as we could now see them from beneath the protective overhang of the bushes. When, with the lilt of the creed on their lips, they disappeared from view down the hill, we sighed with relief. They are like jinns, whispered Zaid. Yes, like the jinns who know neither joy of life nor fear of death. They are brave and strong in faith, no one can deny that, but all they dream about is blood and death and paradise. And, as if in defiance of the Laquan's gloomy puritanism, he began to sing, sotto voice, a very worldly Syrian love song, O thou maiden of golden brown flesh. As soon as it was quite dark, we resumed our surreptitious march in the direction of distant Kuwait. Look there, oh my uncle! Zaid suddenly exclaimed. A fire! It was too small a fire for a Bedouin encampment, a lonely herdsman, perhaps. But what herdsman would dare light a fire here unless he were one of the rebels? Still, it would be better to find out. If it was only one man, we could easily take care of him and also, possibly, gather some precious information about enemy movements in the area. The soil was sandy, and the feet of our camels made almost no noise as we cautiously approached the fire. In its light we could now make out the crouching figure of a solitary Bedouin. He seemed to be peering into the darkness in our direction, and then as if satisfied with what he had seen, he rose without hurry, crossed his arms over his chest, perhaps to indicate that he was unarmed, and calmly, without the least appearance of fright, awaited our coming. Who art thou? Zaid called out sharply, his rifle pointed at the ragged stranger. The Bedouin smiled slowly and answered in a deep, sonorous voice, I am a Sulabi. The reason for his calm now became obvious. The strange, gypsy-like tribe, or rather group of tribes, to which he belonged had never taken part in Arabia's almost unceasing Bedouin warfare, enemies to none, they were attacked by none. The Sulaba, Sulabi, have remained to this day an enigma to all explorers. Nobody really knows their origin. That they are not Arabs is certain. Their blue eyes and light brown hair belie their sunburned skins and carry a memory of northern regions. The ancient Arab historian, tell us that they are descendants of crusaders who had been taken prisoner by Saladin and brought to Arabia, where they later became Muslims, and indeed, the name Sulaba has the same root as the word salib, that is, cross, and salabi, which means crusader. Whether this explanation is correct is difficult to say. In any case, the Bedouins regard the Sulaba as non-Arabs and treat them with something like tolerant contempt. They explain this contempt, which contrasts sharply with the Arabs' otherwise so pronounced sense of human equality, by asserting that these people are not really Muslims by conviction and do not live like Muslims. They point out that the Sulaba do not marry, but are promiscuous like dogs, without consideration even of close blood relationship, and that they eat carrion, which Muslims consider unclean. But this may be a post factum rationalization. I am rather inclined to think that it was the awareness of the Sulaba's racial strangeness that caused the extremely race-conscious Bedouin to draw a magic circle of contempt around them, an instinctive defense against blood mixture. Which must have been very tempting in the case of the Sulaba, for they are, almost without exception, beautiful people, taller than most of the Arabs and of a great regularity of features. The women, especially, are very lovely, full of an elusive grace of body and movement. But whatever the cause, the Bedouins' contempt for the Sulaba has made their life secure, for anyone who attacks or harms them is deemed by his kinsfolk to have forfeited his honor. Apart from this, the Sulaba are highly esteemed by all desert dwellers as veterinarians, saddle makers, tinkers and smiths. The Bedouin, though despising handicraft too much to practice it himself, is nevertheless in need of it, and the Sulaba are there to help him in his need. They are also efficient herdsmen and, above all, unquestioned masters in the art of hunting. Their ability to read tracks is almost legendary, and the only people who can compare with them in this respect are the Almura Bedouins on the northern fringes of the empty quarter. Relieved at finding that our new acquaintance was a Sulabi, I told him frankly that we were Ibn Saud's men, which was quite safe in view of the respect which these people have for authority, and requested him to extinguish his fire. This done, we settled on the ground for a lengthy conversation. He could not tell us much about the disposition of ad-Daesh's forces, for, he said, they are always on the move, like jinns, never resting at one place for long. It transpired, however, that no large concentration of hostile Ikhwan happened to be in our immediate vicinity just now, although small parties were constantly crossing the desert in all directions. An idea suddenly struck me: might we not utilize the Sulabi's instinct for hunting and pathfinding to lead us to Kuwait? Hast thou ever been to Kuwait? I asked him. The Sulabi laughed. Many times. I have sold gazelle skins there and clarified butter and camel wool. Why, it is only 10 days since I returned from there. Then thou couldst perhaps guide us to Kuwait? I mean, guide us in such a manner as to avoid meeting Ikhwan on the way? For a few moments the Sulabi pondered over this question, then he replied hesitantly, I might, but it would be dangerous for me to be caught by the Ikhwan in thy company. I might, though, but it would cost thee a lot. How much? Well, and I could discern the tremor of greed in his voice well. O my master! If thou wouldst give me 100 rials, I might guide thee and thy friend to Kuwait in such a manner that none but the birds of the sky would set eyes on us. 100 rials was equivalent to 10 sovereigns, a ridiculously small sum considering what it would mean to us, but the Sulabi had probably never in his life held so much cash in his hands. I shall give thee 100 rials, 20 now and the rest after we reach Kuwait. Our prospective guide had obviously not expected his demand to be so readily granted. Perhaps he regretted that he had not set his price higher, for, as an afterthought, he added, But what about my dromedary? If I'll ride with you to Kuwait and then back, the poor beast will be worn out entirely, and I have only one. Not wishing to prolong the negotiations, I promptly replied, I shall buy thy dromedary. Thou shalt ride it to Kuwait, and there I shall hand it to thee as a gift, but thou must lead us back as well. That was more than he could have hoped for. With great alacrity he rose, disappeared into the darkness and reappeared after a few minutes, leading an old but beautiful and obviously hardy animal. After some haggling, we settled upon 150 reals as its price, on the understanding that I would pay him 50 now and the rest, together with his reward, in Kuwait. Zaid fetched a purse filled with reals from one of our saddle bags and I started counting the coins into the lap of the Sulabi. From the depths of his bedraggled tunic, he drew out a piece of cloth in which his money was tied, and as he started to add my reals to his hoard, the glitter of a new coin caught my eye. Stop! I exclaimed, placing my hand over his. Let me see that shining real of thine. With a hesitant gesture, as if afraid of being robbed, the Sulabi laid the coin gingerly on the palm of my hand. It felt sharp-edged, like a new coin, but to make sure I lit a match and looked at it closely. It was indeed a new Maria Theresa thaler, as new as if it had just left the mint. And when I held the match over the rest of the Sulabi's money, I discovered 5 or 6 more coins of the same startling newness. Where didst thou get these reals? I came by them honestly, O my master, I swear. I did not steal them. A Mutayri gave them to me some weeks ago near Kuwait. He bought a new camel saddle from me because his was broken. A Mutayri? Art thou certain? I am certain, O my master, and may God kill me if I speak a lie. He was of Ad-Daish's men, one of a party that had recently been fighting against the Amir of Hale. It surely was not wrong to take money from him for a saddle. I could not well refuse, and I am sure that the Shaykh, may God lengthen his life, will understand this. I reassured him that the king would not bear any malice toward him, and his anxiety subsided. On questioning him further, I found that many other Sulaba had received such new reals from various partisans of Ad-Daish in exchange for goods or small services. Our Sulabi indeed proved himself an outstanding guide. For 3 nights he led us a meandering course across rebel territory, over pathless stretches which even Zaid, who knew this country well, had never seen before. The days were spent in hiding. The Sulabi was a past master at finding unsuspected places of concealment. On one occasion he led us to a water hole which, he told us, was unknown even to the Bedouins of the region. Its brackish, brown water assuaged the thirst of our camels and enabled us to refill our water skins. Only twice did we see groups of Laquans in the distance, but on neither occasion were they allowed to see us. In the forenoon of the 4th morning after our meeting with the Sulabi, we came within sight of the town of Kuwait. We did not approach it from the southwest, as travelers from Najd would have done, but from the west, along the road from Basra, so that anyone who met us would think we were Iraqi traders. Once in Kuwait, we made ourselves at home in the compound of a merchant with whom Zaid was acquainted from his days in the Iraqi constabulary. A damp, oppressive heat lay over the sandy streets and the houses built of sun-baked mud bricks, and, accustomed to the open steppes of Najd, I was soon drenched with perspiration. But there was no time for rest. Leaving the Sulabi in charge of the camels, with the strict injunction not to mention to anyone from where we had come, Zaid and I proceeded to the bazaar to make our preliminary investigations. Not being familiar with Kuwait myself, and not wishing to make Zaid more conspicuous by my presence, I remained for about an hour alone in a coffee shop, drinking coffee and smoking a narghile. When Zaid at last reappeared, it was obvious from his triumphant expression that he had found out something of importance. "Let us go outside, oh my uncle. It is easier to talk in the marketplace without being overheard. And here I have brought something for thee, and for me as well," and from under his abaya he produced 2 Iraqi eagles of thick, loosely plaited brown wool. "These will make Iraqis of us." Through discreet inquiries Zaid ascertained that a former partner of his, a companion of his old smuggling days in the Persian Gulf, was now living in Kuwait, apparently still engaged in his accustomed trade. "If there is anyone who can tell us something about gun running in this town, it is Bandar. He is a shammer like myself, one of those stubborn fools who could never fully reconcile themselves to Ibn Saud's rule. We must not let him know that we are working for the Shuyukh, and, I think, not even from where we have come, for Bandar is not really a fool. He is a very cunning man, indeed, he has tricked me too often in the past that I should trust him now." We finally traced the man to a house in a narrow lane close to the main bazaar. He was tall and thin, perhaps 40 years of age, with close-set eyes and a sour, dyspeptic expression, but his features lit up in genuine pleasure when he beheld Zaid. Because of my light skin, I was introduced as a Turk who had settled in Baghdad and had been engaged in exporting Arab horses from Basra to Bombay. "But it does not pay nowadays to bring horses to Bombay," added Zaid. "Those merchants from Anaza and Buraidah have completely cornered the market there." "I know," replied Bandar, "those dirty southerners of Ibn Saud are not content with having taken away our country, they are bent on taking away our livelihood as well." "But what about gun running, Bandar?" asked Zaid. "There should be a lot of business here, with all these mutair and ajman desirous of twisting Ibn Saud's neck, heh." "There was a lot of business," replied Bandar, with a shrug of his shoulders. "Until a few months ago I was making quite good money buying up rifles in Transjordan and selling them to the people of Ad-Daesh. But now Ali, that is finished, entirely finished. You couldn't sell a single rifle now." "How is that?" "I should think Ad-Daesh would need them more than ever before." "Yes," retorted Bandar, "so he does. But he gets them at a price for which one like thee or me could never afford to sell. He gets them in cases, from overseas, English rifles, almost new, and he pays 10 rials for a rifle with 200 rounds of ammunition." "Praise be unto God!" exclaimed Zaid in genuine astonishment. 10 rials for an almost new rifle with 200 rounds, but that is impossible. It really did seem impossible, for at that time used Lee Enfield rifles cost in Najd about 30 to 35 rials apiece, without ammunition, and even if one took into consideration that the prices at Kuwait might be lower than in Najd, the tremendous difference was still unaccountable. Bandar smiled wryly. "Well, it seems that Ad-Daesh has powerful friends. Very powerful friends. Some say that one day he will become an independent Amir in northern Najd." "What thou sayest, O Bandar," I interposed, "is all well and good. Perhaps Ad-Daesh will really make himself independent of Ibn Saud. But he has no money, and without money even the great Alexander could not have built a kingdom." Bandar broke out into a loud guffaw. "Money? Ad-Daesh has plenty of that, plenty of new rials, which come to him in cases, like the rifles, from beyond the sea." "Cases of rials? But that is very strange. From where could a Bedouin obtain cases of new rials?" "That I do not know," replied Bandar. "But I do know that almost daily some of his men are taking delivery of new rials that are reaching them through various merchants in the city. Why, only yesterday I saw Farhan ibn Mashhur at the port supervising the unloading of such cases." This was indeed news. I knew Farhan well. He was a grand-nephew of that famous Syrian Bedouin prince, Nuri Ashjalan, who had once fought together with Lawrence against the Turks. I had first met young Farhan in 1924 in Damascus, where he was notorious for his revels in all the doubtful places of entertainment. Some time afterward he fell out with his great-uncle, migrated with subsection of his tribe, the Ruwayla, to Najd, where he suddenly became pious and joined the Al-Quwan movement. I met him again in 1927 in Ibn Musad's castle at Hale. By then he had donned the huge, white turban of the Ikhwan as a symbol of his newfound faith and was enjoying the bounty of the king. When I reminded him of our previous meetings in Damascus, he quickly changed the subject. Stupid and ambitious as he was, he had seen in Daesh's revolt an opportunity to achieve an independent emirate for himself in Al-Jaf, an oasis north of the great Nufud, for in Arabia, as elsewhere, rebels follow the time-honored practice of dividing the lion's skin before the lion has been killed. So Farhan is here in Kuwait? I asked Bandar. Of course. He comes here as often as Daesh, and goes freely in and out of the Sheikh's palace. The Sheikh, they say, has a great liking for him. But do not the British object to Daesh's and Farhan's coming to Kuwait? I seem to remember that some months ago they announced that they would not allow Daesh or his people to enter this territory. Bandar guffawed again. So they did, so they did. But I have told thee, Daesh has very powerful friends. I am not sure whether he is in town just now, but Farhan is. He goes every evening to the great mosque for the Maghrib prayer. Thou canst see him there with thine own eyes if thou dost not believe me. And see him we did. When, taking Bandar's hint, Zaid and I strolled in the early evening in the vicinity of the great mosque, we almost collided with a group of Bedouins, unmistakably Najdi in bearing, who emerged from around a street corner. At their head was a man in his middle 30s, somewhat shorter than the tall Bedouins who surrounded and followed him, his handsome face adorned by a short, black beard. I recognized him at once. I do not know to this day whether he recognized me. His eyes met mine for a moment, swept over me with a puzzled expression, as if he were trying to recall a dim memory, and then turned away, and an instant later he and his retinue were lost in the throng of people moving toward the mosque. We decided not to extend our clandestine sojourn in Kuwait unduly by waiting for an opportunity to see Daesh as well. Bandar's revelations were confirmed by Zaid's adroit inquiries from other acquaintances in the town. Daesh's mysterious supplies of Lee-Enfield rifles, only superficially disguised as purchases, clearly pointed to a Kuwaiti merchant who had always been prominent as an importer of arms. And the large amounts of mint new Maria Theresa reals that circulated in the bazaars of Kuwait were in almost every case traceable to Daesh and the men around him. Short of seeing his actual depots and examining the consignment papers, which was scarcely within the realm of likelihood, we had enough evidence to confirm the suspicions the king had voiced during his talk with me. My mission was completed, and in the following night we made our way out of Kuwait as stealthily as we had come. During Zaid's and my investigations in the bazaars, our Sulabai had found out that there were no rebel groups at the moment to the south of Kuwait. And so to the south we went, in the direction of Al-Hassa province, which was firmly under the control of the king. After 2 strenuous night marches, we encountered, not far from the coast, a detachment of Banu Hajar Bedouins who had been sent out by the Amir of Al-Hassa to reconnoiter the latest positions of the rebels, and in their company we re-entered loyal territory. Once safely within Ibn Saud's realm, we parted from our Sulabai guide who, contentedly pocketing his well-earned reward, rode away toward the west on the camel I had presented to him, while we continued southward in the direction of Riyadh. The series of articles which I subsequently wrote made it clear for the first time that the rebels were being supported by a great European power. They pointed out that the basic aim of these intrigues was to push Ibn Saud's frontiers southward and, ultimately, to convert his northernmost province into an independent principality between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, which would allow the British to build a railway line across its territory. Apart from this, ad-Da'ish's rebellion offered a welcome means to bring about so much confusion in Ibn Saud's kingdom that he would be in no position to resist, as he had hitherto done. Britain's demands for two important concessions, one of them being the lease of the Red Sea port of Rubig, north of Jeddah, where the British had long wanted to establish a naval base, and the other, control of that sector of the Damascus-Medina railway which runs through Saudi territory. A defeat of Ibn Saud at the hands of ad-Da'ish would have brought these schemes well within the realm of practical possibility. A flash of sensation followed the publication of my articles in the European and Arabic, mainly Egyptian, press, and it may well be that the premature disclosure of all that secret planning contributed something to its subsequent frustration. At any rate, the plan of a British railway from Haifa to Basra was allowed to lapse into oblivion in spite of the large sums which appeared to have been spent for preliminary surveys and was never heard of again. What happened afterward is a matter of history. That same summer of 1929, Ibn Saud protested to the British against the freedom accorded ad-Da'ish to purchase arms and ammunition at Kuwait. Since he had no tangible proof that these arms were being supplied by a foreign power, the king could protest only against the sales as such. The British authorities replied that it was the traders in Kuwait who were supplying arms to the rebels, and that Britain could do nothing to stop this, since in the Treaty of Jeddah of 1927 they had lifted their embargo on the import of arms to Arabia. If Ibn Saud wanted, they said, he too could import arms via Kuwait. When Ibn Saud objected that the very same treaty obliged both Britain and Saudi Arabia prevent in their territories all activities directed against the security of the other party, he received the answer that Kuwait could not be termed British territory since it was an independent sheikhdom with which Britain had no more than treaty relations. And so, the civil war continued. In the late autumn of 1929, Ibn Saud personally took the field, this time determined to pursue ad-Da'ish even into Kuwait if, as had always been the case in the past, that territory remained open to the rebels as a refuge and base for further operations. In the face of this determined attitude, which Ibn Saud took care to communicate to the British authorities, they apparently realized that it would be too risky to pursue their game further. British aeroplanes and armored cars were sent out to prevent ad-Da'ish from retreating again into Kuwaiti territory. The rebel realized that his cause was lost, never would he be able to withstand the king in open battle, and so, he started to negotiate. The king's terms were crisp and clear: the rebel tribes must surrender, their arms, horses, and dromedaries would be taken away from them, ad-Da'ish's life would be spared, but he would have to spend the rest of his days in Riyadh. Ad-Da'ish, always so active and full of movement, could not resign himself to inaction and immobility. He refused the offer. Fighting a last-ditch battle against the overwhelming forces of the king, the rebels were completely routed. Ad-Da'ish and a few other leaders, among them Farhan ibn Mashhur and Naif Abu Kilab, chieftain of the Ayman, fled to Iraq. Ibn Saud demanded ad-Da'ish's extradition. For a time, it seemed that King Faisal of Iraq would refuse his demand by invoking the ancient Arabian law of hospitality and sanctuary, but finally, he gave in. Early in 1930, ad-Da'ish, seriously ill, was handed over to the king and brought to Riyadh. When after a few weeks it became obvious that this time he was really dying, Ibn Saud, with his customary generosity, had him brought back to his family at Arta'iyah, where his stormy life came to an end. And once again peace reigned in the realm of Ibn Saud. And once again peace reigns around the wells of Arja. May God give you life, O wayfarers. Partake of our bounty. Calls out the old Mutayri Bedouin, and his men help us to water our camels. All grudges and enmities of the so recent past seem to be forgotten, as if they had never been. For the Bedouins are a strange race, quick to flare up in uncontrollable passion at even imaginary provocations, and just as quick to swing back to the steady rhythm of a life in which modesty and kindness prevail, always heaven and hell in close proximity. And as they draw water for our camels in their huge leather buckets, the Mutayri herdsmen chant in chorus. Drink, and spare no water. The well is full of grace and has no bottom. 3. On the 5th night after our departure from Hale, we reach the plain of Medina and see the dark outline of Mount Uhud. The dromedaries move with tired step, we have a long march behind us, from early morning deep into this night. Zayd and Mansur are silent, and I am silent in the moonlight. The city appears before us with its crenellated walls and the slim, straight minarets of the Prophet's mosque. We arrive before the gate which, because it faces north, is called the Syrian. The dromedaries shy before the shadows of its heavy bastions, and we have to use our canes to make them enter the gateway. Now I am again in the city of the Prophet, home after a long wandering, for this city has been my home for several years. A deep, familiar quiet lies over its sleeping, empty streets. Here and there a dog rises lazily before the feet of the camels. A young man walks by singing, his voice sways in a soft rhythm and fades away in a side lane. The carved balconies and oriel windows of the houses hang black and silent over us. The moonlit air is lukewarm like fresh milk. And here is my house. Mansur takes leave to go to some friends, while we two make, the camels kneel down before the door. Zayd hobbles them without a word and begins to unload the saddlebags. I knock at the door. After a while I hear voices and footsteps from within. The shine of a lantern appears through the fanlight, the bolts are drawn and my old Sudanese maidservant, Amina, exclaims joyfully. Oh, my master has come home.